Hello everyone, today we talk about the logistical problems of late medieval and early modern artillery. I would like to do it in a broad term. And there are naturally many strictly technical topics related to this that are potentially infinite to discuss. Today I would like first of all to focus in general on the main problems, especially the late medieval great bombards pose and how and why in fact, they evolved, they kind of fell into use, so leaving space to other form of artillery, and especially looking at, generally speaking, how even during this improvement, early medieval artillery was something much more, very difficult to employ, especially from a strictly, not just from a logistical point of view in terms of organization, because that's something that eventually the the modern state, begins to develop to cope with, and it's essentially a matter of resources, of centralization, to give a more functional organization and deployment of these artillery pieces, but also the sheer problems related just to carry that on, or even the technological limits of these cannons that tended on a regular base to simply to explode and to cause objectively even more harm to those who were using it. Obviously, it's an exaggeration than the having an effect, because this is something that was discussed intensely at the time. It's also interesting to read the sources from this, and in fact, I have two passages from two sources. One is Italian, the other is French. I will try to translate them in English, with a certain degree of, with a decent accuracy, because I find they're very interesting. They can show how frequent these problems were, and how the sheer difficulties of caused by physics, because this is objectively the main point. And looking at how the progress of, how you want to call it, of civilization, of also of technology, passed through extremely harsh difficulties, and essentially the same progress is nothing teleologically meant, but it's something that simply stems from a great deal of effort and sweat and tears. And so, yeah, pretty dramatic as it sounds, but I think it really is. If you have followed my videos from some time, I guess you know that I often discuss this technological terms, like saying that technology is nothing that emerges by itself. It's essentially created by people who have a problem to solve. And until there are not the conditions for that problem to occur in the first place, because maybe you're still backwards even in other more elementary things, you do not progress. You don't. Technology doesn't pop out by itself. Doesn't immediately, gets discovered, gets applied, and the system grows. It's not how history of technology works. How it, and I realize many people have technologistic prejudices, as most modern people. I've been having them, I think, on average when I was younger. Now I kind of try to make a bit of disclosure to say, and I don't go much more far than this, simply because I can offer certain examples like this ones and give a broader idea, but I'm not a historian of technology nor a historian of economics, so nor of science, so, and just a humble medievalist trying to say something meaningful on YouTube. So, and you say, well, you're a medievalist, why do you venture into the realms of the mysterious realms of modern history? It's because, I really love it as well. I think if I had not studied medieval history, I would have probably concentrated on the modern age. I'm very passionate, especially about the 17th century. I haven't been discussing it much on Schwerpunkt, but that's something we will have to improve. And from some month, as you probably realize, I inserted into Schwerpunkt this modern warfare playlist. Aside essentially from medieval history, I don't make any other kind of manualistic video, but I could start. So let me just know if you're interested in, general modern history. I can put up something. I believe so. That can be interesting for all involved. Just for saying that I tend to make videos about all ages in history. I think I left out now contemporary history. I haven't made anything that goes about something that goes later than the early 18th century, and I will have to start that as well, but for now I'm just sticking to this. And after all, today's videos is also pretty borderline between the Middle Ages and the early modern era, so it's easier to tell it than making premises. So now I could make introductions about how objectively the problem, maybe we'll talk about it another time. I mean, how these cannons were practically built in all the problems that took, the various metal leagues, and how these ovens also were. This is not maybe important, but let's say that there were many technical problems in the first place to cast to fabricate in general cannons at this point. So this had naturally influenced massively the way artillery was built at the beginning. So there were these needs always to keep in mind, together with the scarce efficacy of the and the modest penetration of the stone balls that essentially made this kind of great bombards was falling into disuse. I don't know how you say that. This had been the average really in 15th century. The main artillery was these enormous bombards that were counting, in fact, more in the dimensions than else, that shot these stone balls, and that they were called, in fact, batteries sometimes in certain sources, because they had this usually stone walls, and they were pretty big, usually long, between 5 and 6 meters long, and so you understand also something very cumbersome. Now I just remembered, excuse me once again, that I made some videos about this type of artillery. If you go into the either medieval warfare or modern warfare playlists, you should find something. And I hate when I don't find here immediately the playlist. Damn it. Modern warfare, let's see if it is here. But it was also mostly about... No, it wasn't. It was still in medieval warfare. Yeah, I made a video about I think the very first one was about the Dardanelles guns. There were actually several, but it's the one that survived that we talk about. The great Turkish bombard. Then I made, I think, something else about artillery that I can't see. Yeah, 15th century artillery types, and this is why I think it's important. Bombards, Vogler, serpentines, culverins, crapado, mortars, and so on. So that is a good introduction if you want to look a bit more at the dimensions of the also the shooting range, the capabilities of this artillery. That I also discuss about logistics in that. So it's we're talking about these guns now, those guns. And okay, I can go on. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before. So the main limitations, now these great bombers have many limitations, as a matter of fact, and they, first of all, they could shoot only a few times during the day. Normally not more than 1 or 2 shots per hour. So this practically meant that in half a day you were done with this, because especially around the 10th shot the bombard exploded. Yes, this is something that happened all the time, and it was actually known. There was this autonomy, this limitation for which around the 10th shot such artillery had these structural characteristics that made them simply collapse. So you can imagine what it meant also from a sheer economical point of view to use these cannons, this artillery, because these bombards say better, because to be more specific, think just about the cost of producing a bombard like that. Think of all the resources, all the manpower, the craftsmen, the costs that it took to first of all take all the metal that was used, that was also already pretty expensive. That, you know, resources are not drawn just from already done. You need someone who works them, you need someone who prepares them, and so on, who transports them actually in the place where it has to be worked. So think of all the calories that could be, you know, in sheer, in fact, physical terms, that could be spent just to be burnt, just to assemble a bombard, as a matter of fact, and to transport it. All the muscular force of animals, of draught animals and men, as we will say also later, and all for what? For basically taking this artillery in one place, making it shoot for essentially half of a day, and then exploding, and with this explosion even sometimes even killing the people who were around there. This was naturally something very bad, naturally existed because it was still a convenience overall, because if artillery had developed in the first place, it's because it was useful. And during the 15th century, there is a rise of artillery that actually can be observed also from the previous centuries, but in dimensionally in a as a less as a lesser as a minor phenomenon compared to the following century. But in the 15th century, it's like artillery starts emerging and developing much faster, and everybody basically starts producing, every king, every sovereign in Europe starts having its own arsenal, which also costed a lot, because this entailed not just to draw this artillery from somewhere, from the local communities that also had their own tiny artillery. This time also the sizes could vary widely. In that video I mentioned here before, I discussed exactly this, how certain even categories of artillery were sometimes defined in fact just by the shape of the gun, but not really the dimension. So you could have several different type of gun that could be so small and something huge of several meters, that essentially in fact it could be used just for certain purposes or not. So you have to imagine that also a 15th century siege is something still extremely rudimental in many ways, with so many different cannons which shoot from different positions, that are all suited for the characteristics of the single gun. Also because, I repeat, the cost was enormous. So for one great bombard you would have a plethora of different smaller guns that obviously had a much less effective impact on the siege, because these were mostly and almost exclusively siege weapons. Field artillery is something that actually existed since, at Battle of Crécy you find something like that, but it was just, okay, we have these guns, let's use them, and together with all the other things we have, because it's always something additional, but naturally the effect was relatively virtually influent. Even though for Crecy, I think there is some source that says something like that. This artillery was, I don't know, it shocked the enemy or something like that. But it's pretty unlikely that, aside from the novelty that it could pose, which also is relative because artillery was beginning to appear at this time also in other places. Especially, I don't know in northern France, like in that case, but was something that started appearing definitely from the beginning of the 14th century. Even the first, you have always to bear in mind that many of these technological improvements are also something relatively hidden to us historically, because we don't have the exact process of when the very first artillery was created. Probably it's not even in technological terms a valid question, because the concept is pretty much there. I mean, the explosion into a cane or a barrel that can propel a projectile is something extremely intuitive. It doesn't take much to learn or to understand. Once that you have even the torsion artillery is something you can figure out if you have something that explodes and gives this shock. So the point is what the application was, and indeed these cannons were used exclusively in siege artillery, and also part of the reason probably why these bombards were so great was indeed and it's pretty self-evident, the achievement of a major damage against city walls or castles, whatever you want to shoot against in terms of fortification, so that you basically try to reach the maximum actually a compromise between the effectiveness of the shot and the size of the artillery and all the costs attached to it. So if these artillery existed, it's because they were useful in a way or another. So the ratio cost benefit was actually in favor of the costs. Of the benefits. But the overall, so you don't use something that is useless, and especially when it starts appearing at such a structural level, you understand it worked. But there were so many problems at this point. And so as we were saying before, you basically brought this bombard at a siege, you fixed in there, and you knew that it could shoot essentially only around 10 shots. So just think about, it's half of a day of bombardment, so even think about the rate of fire, something pretty slow. At this time, maybe much more could be achieved in a siege through crossbows than artillery, or at least they all acted in concert. By the way, I always think that there was an extremely dynamic interaction of all these guns, because it was something in all these weapons, because it was also empirical in many ways. After all, what did you need? This artillery naturally was meant to smash the enemy walls. That's something you could do also with trebuchet at the time, and I give you that especially towards the second half of the 15th century. Fortifications start to be built essentially with other principles, especially in certain areas of Europe. And about this I can advise you if you are interested, because it started happening exactly with these great bombards. Another video made that is called 15th Century Origins of the Trace Italienne. So basically the origins of the art of fortification that remained practically invaried up to the at least in the essential. Okay, there was Vauban, but it's something that conceptually went also in Vauban eventually, and something that dominated military architecture and consequently all military engineering, because it also influenced the development of other artillery for centuries in early modern Europe. And so the country that seemingly had the greatest development from this point of view of the changing of this type of artillery was France. That the French are usually credited to have had this first park of artillery worth of this name. This is not entirely true in the sense that it was the Burgundians that were still French, telling the truth, but telling the truth also with Flemish artillery, because Burgundy at that time controlled not just the French region, but also the lowlands, the Flanders, and those were all cities that were advancing pretty much. So Burgundy was very rich. It had this technologically advanced communities that produced lots of artillery into Flanders and so on. So they were able to create a park of artillery was actually more ancient and more numerous initially, at least, than one of the French kingdom. And then France basically manages to win the 100 Years' War. So it re-expands at one point from a peak that it hadn't reached, but in the 13th century, and is able to invest and makes all these wars of conquest, starts expanding into the northeast of France, into the east of France, and therefore, given also the legacy of the 100 Years' War that had seen, in fact, especially from the French side, the rise of artillery, the French have to tank artillery for, because otherwise they would have remaining, defeated by the English armies at that point. It wasn't just about artillery, but generally speaking, that's something they helped them a lot, actually. Especially the campaign in Normandy, but against the English fortresses there, it was something to which artillery had a crucial importance. And this is just for saying the French kept invading other regions and using artillery. So this actual momentum, offensive momentum that was, managed to prolong itself thanks to the use of artillery, because the concept, even not just from a tactical point of view, but also from a strategical point of view, is that you have lots of cannons, you can smash big fortresses, and therefore you can seize in one shot a big city. This was the main goal, because we have been discussing it other times. I mean, the concept of, especially in that video on the origins of the traces italiennes, is that indeed, into the Middle Ages, fortifications like castles had worked perfectly, because given the technological potential, there was no other way to cope with that. Now, the whole Europe could be theoretically, if the traces italiennes, in fact, had not been developed, could be easily seized, especially cities. Not just about fortresses that also were a bit more complicated to assault, even with this new artillery, but especially these big, wealthy cities that were rising. Pretty much in this 15th century Europe, that had, old style city walls that naturally could also withstand artillery in part, but that were now much easier to conquer than it was before, just with trebuchet. So this means if there is a very florid center that dominates a region, it basically takes you to take that, and a bunch of fortresses all around, but now it's much easier. So if you have all this artillery combined, you know that you can employ those weapons in order to seize considerable strategical resources. And that's what France starts doing, and that's also how they eventually, and we'll see it later, they invaded Italy. They began the so-called Italian wars that engulfed the continent for like 70 years. And the idea is that, however, this entailed great changes also in not just in artillery or in military engineering, but more broadly in the statal and consequently military organization, because this meant that, for instance, great pitched battles now were to be more necessary, because it was much easier to stop someone in open field at that point with a direct confrontation than to do it just by enclosing your own castle, in your own city, as you were used to do into the Middle Ages. So that's why, for instance, the Renaissance art of war, at this point rockets and develops so much, because once again, tactically speaking, there are new necessities that bring you to field, or at least that force you. So with all the force related to it, greater formations that also have to be more maneuverable. Also, field artillery starts timidly to be something, especially at the beginning of the 16th century. So there is a dynamicization of tactics. Also, think of the strategical range. I mean, the idea, in fact, you can conquer so much quicker certain centers now, certain fortified centers, means that your armies can travel much faster, because back in the Middle Ages, at every castle you basically had to stop and start bombarding it with trebuchets that weren't exactly the fastest way to destroy a castle, and sometimes they were even ineffective. At this point, you can simply bombard that castle for some time and it's gonna crumble. So what you could achieve back in the day with, I don't know, in 1 month, now you could do it in just 1 week. Just, I'm approximating, of course, but just to give you the idea that also this entailed whole territories to create a wholly different military organization. It naturally happened very progressively, but that had long enduring consequences in European warfare that at this point gets a bit more kinetic than it had been in the past, which doesn't mean it was better or worse. It's just a matter of context of conditions. So the French, as this great, actually the most powerful country in Europe at this time, I think not really more powerful than the Ottomans at this point. Well, it depends, because the Ottomans were rising in this point, but definitely Western Europe being the greatest power, began, and that had also a very peculiar political and institutional system, for which the French monarchy was definitely, in spite of feudalism that was rampant still at the time, it was much more centralized. France had a political culture and tradition at the time that basically allowed to the king much more autonomies and powers than other countries. Theoretically, also in France, the king was limited in the sense that he was king just for defending the customs. The customs of the subjects and so on, but the French, let's say, were more prone to obey to the king than other countries, and France had this massive agricultural resource. France also at this point missed many chances, in the sense that French feudalism maintained cavalry in this Renaissance warfare as a very important element of the army, and actually French infantry sucked. The French at this point tried to, this was also a political and social thing, because naturally the feudal elite wanted to rule, so even the French king, equipping himself with, say, pikemen, squares of pikemen, was doing something not just military but also political. That is, trying essentially to have a central army that could be also used against the noble cavalry, and therefore trying to seize more power from these private feudatories and so on. But unfortunately, from the French king, actually the attempts to create a squares of pikemen, just like the Swiss or the Landsknechts or the Spanish tercio, basically failed. Francis I at one point created something like it was called the French Legion. It was, at this time, everybody was obsessed, by the way, at copying the Romans, because this is the Renaissance, never forget it. And this he actually created them, but they sucked so badly that he preferred to spend a whole lot of money to hire the usual Swiss mercenaries than having a French infantry on their own. But we have to give credit in this sense to the French, that in spite of this cultural limit that objectively made them lose the opportunity to become the hegemonic power of Europe before even Louis XIV in the 17th century, the French developed given all the agricultural resources they had, so theoretically the possibility the other countries didn't have, for instance like Italy, or to have such enormous quantity of men to be recruited into the army. They, however, began to develop artillery and to make a very, good use of it. In fact, at the thresholds of the modern age, of the modern era, indeed, the French artillery was considered the strongest around. There is a bit of mythology in here, because the Italians themselves, when they were invaded, and I'm talking about Machiavelli actually, when they were invaded by the French in 1494, and how disastrous this eventually was for the Italian peninsula, because they even made it at a certain point to defeat and capture the French king, which managed to flee. But they eventually, the French invasion opened to this, even to this idea to other European sovereigns, that Italy was so easy at least to invade, and that's how the Italian wars eventually kept happening in there, and how the great parts of Italy were brought under eventually the Habsburgs, Spanish Habsburg domination at that point. But the Italians began to develop in the elites this sense of defeatism by saying, "Oh, look at these guys! They arrived. They basically." We couldn't even hold them. So Machiavelli, that is an extraordinary author, but says many bad things and many wrong things historically speaking, including this one, is that practically French artillery was technologically more developed than, in that case, the Italian one. This is actually false. I mean, it's not truly that. I mean, what the French here had, it wasn't really about the size or the quality of the cannons. That also the Italians were pioneering in their smaller arsenals of their lordships, but however it was much better organized. Yes, this is the point. It's all about logistics. You can have the best technologies, the best know-how, but if you don't have the resources to put that up into something that you can doctrinally use for military use, you're not going to do anything about it. So France at this point had two great things that Italians didn't have. That is a national monarchy, and in this sense, a whole lot of resources meant that that monarchy controls, in that case, the whole France, and can invest massive capitals into, just having a bunch of guns. And obviously, if you take, the Charles VIII artillery train, it was something ridiculous compared to, I don't know, just what 50 years later Europe standards would be. But definitely at the time was something enormous, something in fact that allowed him to arrive in Italy and to have all his gates open simply because he threatened to bombard every single place, and he made it to Naples, and even eventually to make it back to France, passing through all over Italy. So the French were famed rightfully at this point for these achievements, and these they were starting as well to use basically a model park of artillery, because they were they were not just the country that had the largest park, but also the one that was starting to systematically, and this is very important during modern age because it entails the concept of standardization. They were systematically applying the most updated military technologies to this park, so that they had these improvements that basically were created on large scale and could use, in fact, be used en masse practically. So it's not that individually, the most technologically advanced countries at this time in the world were Italy and Germany. So they also had better technology, but they didn't, Germany and Italy, being also fragmented, politically speaking, didn't have the chance to put up, all what the French individually were able to do. So the French began also to do what would be the future, that was being the future because it had been already figured out, that is the use of iron balls. So now iron balls were first of all less voluminous, because you could have a much higher specific weight. So in a small ball you could have the same mass practically than and weight, hence, of the stone balls. So this meant, first of all, a whole lot of volume saved, which means that, okay, you still physically have to make the same effort to carry those projectiles, but at least you have to use less carts, which is not a few, because you have also to consider the weight of more carts, and the animals, the draught animals that have to pull that, and the feeding for those animals. So you could save actually just through this pretty modest thing, because cast iron is not anything at that time so technologically advanced. Iron was always like that. At this point, they manage to organize things to extend this new projectiles to the by the way, there is another point to make. This, I said that they had the same weight, but not really, because the iron ball in this sense could have also a smaller weight, but to be more concentrated. This is very important. This is a mathematical relation, actually, equation. You can have in terms of volume, something that that is much larger in proportion than objectively the weight that is in it. So maybe you even have smaller projectiles, but the point is that that's the effect that it has to have on the walls, because if you concentrate, it's a matter of specific weight. It's a matter of specific weight. You can even have something very small that, however, in proportion maybe to that is of ratio of volume and mass is more concentrated, and something greater that even weights more, but that in this sense is going to make a whole lot of damage on a wall, on any surface that you hit, just because that mass here is more concentrated in a lesser space. By the way, cast iron in this sense can also be a bit more regular. The stones, yeah, they were basically shaped in a round form, and there were people who had practically to do it all the time. This happened also with not just with the fire with guns. It happened also with the trebuchet. I made a video that shows how, for instance, how organization had been important even into the Middle Ages to have a reserve of projectiles. For instance, in the Kingdom of England, back in the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, was a great military organization that entailed, in fact, that caused so many benefits in terms of just having available that amount of roundly shaped stones to use in the trebuchet. And you know that the sphere has this great importance as a bullet, because theoretically, from a sheer purely mathematical geometrical concept, if you have a perfect sphere, and when you throw it against something, it's only a virtually infinitively small place, point of its surface is gonna hit the the object. Now, in real life, this is not possible, because obviously perfect spheres do not exist. But the concept is that the more the sphere is perfect in this sense, and the smaller is the surface that is gonna hit on the on another object, and that all the force that is contained, all the kinetic energy that is contained into the flying ball is gonna smash exactly into that tiny point. So it's gonna make a hell of a damage on a single point, and therefore increase penetration on the walls. Sorry, I was still searching the video. This was, I think, breaching enemy walls. Considerations on medieval siege warfare, 885-1332. That deals with that, and also with the, in fact, of these logistical problems that the English at that time were kind of pioneering simply because they had a better organization than other armies. I'm not saying, I don't know, maybe the Kingdom of France had something similar, I don't know, but at least we have evidence. The armies of Edward I had this kind of efficiency and also technological development at the time, for those time standards that were rarely found in other places. And just for saying that only the availability of these projectiles sometimes made the difference between, because normally before the there were together with the train, there were certain stone cutters that had to come there and literally pick up the stone along the road during the march and work in it and basically to sculpt it, so to chisel it in order to make it a good projectile. So overall, even what I was saying is that the French at this point, by using this greater amount of cast iron balls, they also saved a lot in volume, and even in weight. And they, by the way, iron balls could be obtained very rapidly. And as we have seen, they also had a remarkable penetration force. So the minor diameter of such balls allowed also another very important thing, that is the reduction of the caliber of the weapons. So this allowed in turn a reduction in also in length, because you know that length and caliber were at those times conditions to be strictly connected. If you have a smaller projectile, you can have definitely a smaller cannon. Telling the truth, at this point the cannons also augment proportionally their length, which means that it became smaller, so that those great bombards began to fall into use, but proportionally the ratio length and say caliber increased definitely. So this also allowed, among the other things, to have a greater range in proportion and a more precise shot, because it's physical. The longer the barrel is, and the more the projectile is gonna fly straight. And at the time, it was already clear. So these are not innovations that happened because someone woke up and said, "Oh wow, let's do it in this way." But this stemmed, in fact, mostly from logistical reasons, from organizational points of view, because it's not the point here that this was formulated. This came into practice by itself, because those who could organize and invest more money in this, they realized it was much more convenient, in fact, to create iron balls for larger armies. So that at that point, it's not that nobody had ever thought about it, but sometimes it could be more convenient than, instead of putting up a forge and so on, to simply cut the stones, because artillery was not so even developed locally. You just needed those few balls. Also, those bombards didn't shoot more than much. Instead, where political, especially in social dynamics, bring you to make more war and more effectively, you realize that through organization, new technology kicks in, because it's only the conditions that are required for that organization that before didn't exist, because there were the political and social premises brought you to find these new solutions. So that's how eventually the artillery evolved, technologically speaking. And that's a very good example of what I was telling you at the beginning of the video, that technology is not really something that drives the progress, but it's progress that drives technology. And it's a progress in also in a very neutral sense. It's simply an evolution, transformation, not necessarily something. Also because through this more mechanical solutions, naturally there were many skills that were partially lost in the meanwhile, or others that were kind of now changing. For instance, during the modern age, I don't know if you ever thought it, but there is a great change also in, culturally speaking, considering the ironsmiths. You know, the ironsmith in the medieval times was a sort of, especially in the northern world with these legions, with the dwarves, you know, the idea that there was the relation with the underground, these gnonic forces with magics and so on. During the modern age, it was this great, you know, taking out these people from their huts, from their place, and to be hired as engineers to cast these weapons, to, you know, and even from one side in this sense improving the technology from that side, but also losing much knowledge that existed before. It was much more empirical, if you want, but it was still something that individually was lost over time. So as we were saying, the main at this point, the main, say, the principal problems of the time were in fact the ones determined by the relation between in the artillery pieces between length, caliber, thickness, and also the very importantly, the relation between the quantity of powder that was set in the charge and the power of the shot. That is, in fact, the range in this sense. So there was another problem. So actually, these changes in artillery didn't bring an end to those problems of the gun exploding after a certain number of shots. And in fact, there was this fear, this constant fear, that the piece would explode practically constantly. So that tendentially to try to have more shots in the end. So also in here was everything was equilibrated in a fashion, pros and cons. The crewmen tended to prepare weak charges. So this naturally was a compromise between the range, the effectiveness, the cinetic energy was transferred to the projectile that could, in that sense, deliver it eventually against the fortification that it was wanted to be smashed, and the same effectiveness of the shot, because, you know, the less the charge is powerful, and the more the hit is going to be ineffective, or the shot in itself. So therefore this problem remained actually for a very long time. And as between actually both the 15th and the 16th century, cannons after a tens of shots normally exploded. So you were was kind of a you know, people at the time were kind of resigned of this, and there was a lot of debate revolving around this as well, because it was said that objectively these firearms were more dangerous for those who used them than for those against whom they were used, and in part this was right. So now I would like to quote you, if I'm able to translate it correctly, a passage from Alessandro di Filippo Rinuccini, the journey to the Holy Sepulchre. Now, Rinuccini was he was born, I think, around the 30s of the 15th century. He came from an important Tuscan, a Florentine family, if I'm not wrong, and he was son of sort of important people. He was a humanist, as many Italians, you know, as many elite Italian elite of that time. And he also practiced a bit of he had some commercial education. He worked in London for the Medici. He remained there for some time, and after that he came back to Italy, and he became a Dominican friar. So at this point he began to study mostly the fathers of the church, and he was also a very praised preacher at that point. And he spent himself for the poor. At least this is how the picture we have for them. And he made this journey towards Jerusalem in 1473. So at this time it was still the Mamluk Sultanate, I think, in the hands of Mamluk, and they and he arrived. He made it. So he made this. He wrote this work, and it was also pretty. Especially coming back was a pretty bit of difficulty. And he basically writes the account of this journey. So telling all the various, and it would be interesting to talk more about it. But essentially here, he talks about a stop that his galley made in Corfu. So I will try to translate this now. So, or to paraphrase it, maybe it's better. Basically, here he narrates that the ship now was stopped at Corfu, and because by the way, these travels were usually also a way to travel at the time was to go on to the merchant ships, mercantile ships. Sorry, it was normal for these ships to stop at every place, just because not just of the galleys that objectively have to stop frequently, because they were stuffed with crewmen, and they usually slept in on land during the night, but also because there was a lot of trade. So the ship now was mooring at Corfu, and here it says basically that I think there was the election of a Venetian Doge at this point. So the galleys started to, I mean, from the towers of the castles of Corfu, there were many bombards shot at this point to celebrate the new election. This these were loaded with blanks, hopefully, but nevertheless, they basically from the ship they began to respond to these celebrations by shooting their bombers themselves. So everybody was happy, according to the authors. So we're all excited. Just think about, it's like doing fireworks in a certain sense, and it's kind of funny objectively to see a cannon shooting. And here it says that from the ship they had shot about 30 times with great magnificence, it says. So here it's interesting because indeed the author calls magnificent something that was just shooting blank, and it is kind of magnificent. Think about all the smoke. By the way, at this time artillery made a freaking lot of smokes, especially when they began to spread more frequently on the battlefields, both on land and on sea. They sometimes you really couldn't see anything because of all the smoke. This is a problem so sometimes shooting also happened, you shot blindly many times. This is notorious, that also in times of pike and shot, or during times of linear tactics in the 18th century, nobody even saw what they were shooting at. It's famous. Think about Gettysburg. That it was a place, and this happened in fact towards the very end of the 19th century. That when through different chemicals, technology allowed basically to shoot with a, making much less smoke, and therefore now seeing and also increasing accuracy. So just for telling how technology progresses, sometimes also pretty slowly. So just imagine this boom, 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 boom from the between from the fortifications of Corfu and the galleys in here in this Venetian context. And however, here an accident happened, because first of all, Rinuccini says that some of these bombards basically got splintered and broken, and this was, by the way, considered just shot blank. So this means that they didn't have a projectile inside. It is also, that physically speaking, if you make an action, it corresponds an equal and contrary reaction. So usually also the cannon gets the recoil. That also is something pretty dangerous as well. And so some of these bombers got destroyed, and there is a cannon in here that he calls actually cannon and not bombard or spingarde, I think. There is that however had a pretty intense recoil for some reason, because recoil is gonna happen anyway, and basically this cannon, after a shot, since it had not been properly stuffed in the back with something to absorb the recoil, it kind of went out of its lodgement, and he hit the one of the crewmen on his leg, and even if he didn't, the bomber didn't hit, the cannon didn't hit the crewman very, fully. He nevertheless made a great damage to him, so that basically they had to send him on land, and he eventually remained in Corfu to get medical aid. But the most important part is that it got splintered. So these bombards were not even shooting bullets, so they had a much less physical trauma at this point and just shooting blank. They got splintered and broken anyway. So this tells you how frequently, and here it says, it doesn't say how many bombers there were, but it just says that they, from the ship, they had fired 30 shots essentially. It's not a lot. So this gives you a dimension of how, limited the use of cannons could be. Because if those cannons had been loaded, they would have broken even before having shot 30 times. And these people kind of got exalted celebrating that Dodge election, and they ended up like with a guy with a wounded leg. Another very important part is that it's from Philippe de Commynes regarding the expedition of Charles VIII into Italy. Here it's very important because it shows you actually the other great problem, that is actually something much more massive also in terms of organizational capabilities and of sheer energies that are spent to solve it. That is the hindrance that the nuisance that the firearms caused during the marches. You had to carry those things. Like in this case, through half of Europe, sorry. So from France to Italy, and one time back and forth, practically. So as we were saying, these firearms were usually pulled by over great carts, were transported on great carts and pulled by oxen usually, and it was very frequent that these carts would knock over to topple in some way, or that they got bogged down. Consider what roads at the end of the 15th century could be most of the times, especially in certain passages like the one we were looking now. Sometimes they simply broke down, so that at this time, eventually there were, well, actually a bit later, there was a, excuse me, I drink a little bit. And there was the problem of, especially when field artillery began to happen, to create the certain junctions between the carriage and the horses to basically make this junction more mobile, so that the cannon could be carried by being more flexible and not being this just pulled by this rigid. I don't know. There is a very specific term in artillery that it's called to these bars that are fixed to the animals that were used, or to the people that could carry them, whatever. And the problem in there was that these cannons were extremely heavy, so these mechanisms that allowed a bit of to turn a little bit, to twist essentially and turn, were pretty delicate as mechanisms, and they could easily break down. I don't remember, I think I talked about this in one of those videos I told you before. It also where you can get the more specific term that now, unfortunately, I'm sorry, but I can't remember. However, this is not important now. And this was a factor, however. I mean, the problem of transporting artillery that influenced a greater development into fortress artillery than field artillery. Because, I mean, just one of the factors, because as we've seen, practically field artillery before the early 16th century was pretty small thing. It wasn't, there was still the technology to make it something consistent, to, very progressively throughout the 16th century field artillery begins to be a thing that could influence substantially as a factor the result of this. And this depended naturally also how it was used, how certain tactics were carried out. Things about the Swiss at the Battle of Marignano during the Italian Wars, those squares got butchered down by I think in that case it was the same French artillery, and if I'm not wrong, and so it took a while, really, and even the fire rate was still pretty small. So virtually, and the most important use of artillery was definitely in siege warfare. So all the problem also of moving the artillery on the field is something that will be solved only pretty late, relatively late. Usually artillery, even on the field, was meant to, at this time, to remain there and not to move substantially, so that it was limited in so many ways. However, I would like to quote now, in fact, the memoir of Philippe de Commynes, which talks about the passage of the Cisa Pass into Italy, that is towards in Pontremoli. That is this passage that practically connects the region, the Po Valley, with Tuscany, This was very important because many armies had to pass through there. And incidentally, by the way, I think this, however, this was in 1495. I mean, this was the moment in which the French were coming back. So actually, they were about to cross the Caesar Pass and to be met by the army of the Italian League at the famous Battle of Fornovo. So here they were coming back, really, I think. However, this is not important given the passage, but still interesting as a setting. So here it says, also here I'm translating, trying to paraphrase a little bit. So here the French had other problems also in terms of supplies and so on, because they were in hostile territory, and here Philippe de Commynes praises the Germans in the French army that were there. If I'm not wrong, there were Landsknechts also into the French army at this point, as it was a bit like the Swiss that initially were created just to be used by, that specific political entity, and eventually they begin to sell their services also abroad. And here it speaks of the Germans. They are protagonists of the story. It says that they went to the king to offer this. I don't know if they were prisoners of war also in part. I don't really know. I don't really know here, because it says certain things. It says that basically they went to the king to offer. They offered the king to deal with the passage of artillery over this very peculiar road between the mountains, across the mountains, so that eventually the king would forgive them for something that now I'm missing. However, this is not important. It says, by the way, Commynes makes a note, and when it calls this passage mountains, because objectively the Caesar Pass is not so it doesn't have very impervious mountains all around. It's just a hell of a pass by itself, mostly because of the road. Here it says, because here the guys, Philippe de Commynes says that it says actually that these mountains are very high and cliffed and precipiced, more or less, and there is no frequented road here. Here was my point, and here it says, I have seen all the mountains that are in Italy and Spain, and it's that are bigger, but it would have been easier to make artillery pass through those mountains than into this Caesar Pass. So it was a hell of a passage here. And so here it says the Germans made this promise with the condition that the King Charles VIII would forgive them, and the king accepts. So here it says there were 14 pieces of great and powerful artillery, and this valley began to climb essentially, and the road was definitely very very steep, and even the mules were passing with great exertion, great strain, great effort. So the Germans operated in pair with good ropes, and they pulled in 100 or 200 at a time, so that when the first were tired, the others basically supplanted them, replaced them, and there were also the horses of artillery that were pulling, and anyone then that of the king's house that was following lent a horse, hoping to make this operation quicker. And however, without the Germans, the horses alone would have never made it. So this is important because it's saying basically that normally the draught animals that were the major force that was used to pull this artillery couldn't make it without the men's support. And here it's interesting that there were hundreds of people pulling this artillery up to the pass at a time. Then it says, to tell the truth, they didn't make pass just the artillery, and if it hadn't been for them, nobody would have crossed the pass, for sure, for certain. So it says other things, and it says that they also made certain things very bad, but the good was more than the bad here. So that it's referring to certain technical mistakes that these Germans had initially done, but that's normal. When you have some logistical problems to solve, you go by attempts, and eventually they were able to solve this thing. And the war, and here is very interesting actually, because now they pulled the cannons up to the pass. Now the problem, he says, the worst was not coming up. It was not climbing, going up to the slope. The problem now was coming down, because there was a valley from the other side. So now they had crossed the pass, and paradoxically, it was much more difficult, at least Commynes says, to take the artillery down than taking it up. Because, he says, the road, the way in here has not been made by nature in a way that presents anything that can help for doing this. So it occurred at that point to put the horses and the men to pull from backwards, in the sense that the artillery, at least this is how interpreted, is that the artillery was by gravity coming down from the other side, but I couldn't let it fall down because it would have crashed. So they basically were making the horses and the men let it just going down slowly. And here Commynes says, and this was without comparison definitely more tiring than coming, that they had been to come up, essentially. And then it says, and also another very obvious thing, that at every pass, because evidently there were several, there wasn't just one pass on the pass, there were several parts. It was there were carpenters and farriers that were needed, and there was also the need to put to straighten, to set upright the certain artillery piece that knocked over, that toppled, and this was very, very tiring. And here it says another very important thing. It says many were of the opinion that the heavy artillery had to be broken in order to cross as soon as possible, but the king never wanted to allow this. This is very interesting, but it is because at this point this French army says, okay, let's get rid of the heavy artillery, let's break it down so we can pass more easily. And the king says, no, we don't have to do it. So the Marshal of Gier, that was 30 miles from us, incited the king to hurry up, and it took us 3 days to reach him. and he had the enemies encamped in front of him in a good plan at half of a league of distance, and if they had attacked them, they would have easily defeated both him and then them. So these were the Italians from the other side that were now come with the army of close to Fornovo that were about to meet them in battle. So here you can understand. I find this is very interesting because it tells you really it gives you the effort. Aside from me speaking very poorly in English, giving this translation, but it gives you really the effort, the fatigue that it took to transport this artillery, all the problems that it caused, all the even this army that is split in two, because we have seen that here the Marshal of Jay was already 30 miles ahead, because evidently he didn't have the same problems of the main army with the siege train, with the artillery park, and he was already ahead. He was asking the king, to hurry up, because in the meanwhile the army of the Italic League was approaching, and he could easily defeat them if they had been divided. So this is I think very, very interesting. Also the details with the concerning the difficulties that it took, not just for climbing but also for coming down, and so on. So this artillery actually would participate to the Battle of Fornovo, and that was also very interesting. Maybe one day we will discuss it. But I think that this is more or less what I wanted to say for today, and to make you just reflect a little bit on how these problems were so concrete, how even such a great artillery like the French one was considered, in fact, so precious, and it's a resource that all the sovereigns of Europe at that time wished they had, especially the resources to afford, was however still very difficult to use, not just on not much on the field in sieges, but practically, especially during the marches. That this could be actually also a very carrying this artillery could create many unpleasant strategical consequences, like in here, because we have seen that the army was even considerably slowed down. So this gave the enemy, great time, also to a greater time to cope with it. I mean to exploit, this gap, and think of also with the exhaustion. Here it says it took all the horses and hundreds of men to pull up this artillery, and all the this existed since the Middle Ages. I mean, all the carpenters, or all the farriers, all the people who had sometimes to tow these things up by themselves, and this is a problem that, telling the truth, especially in mountain warfare, is still present. It's still widely present. And it's interesting, in fact, that even if you look at certain scenarios like the Alpine front during World War I, there are similar episodes like this. People who have to carry these extremely, at this point, 20th century artillery in up to certain points into the mountains. Here, Commynes says that not even the mules passed with ease on this track, and mules normally can't pass in very harsh terrain. So think of all the immense difficulties that exist at this point. And mountain warfare actually hasn't, I can say it hasn't changed much, because obviously it did, but in the essentials, these problems posed by nature, by physical problems, by heights, they're always there. Because objectively it's always the same story. I mean, it's very easy to carry an artillery on a flat land. It's not on a mountain. It doesn't matter which age you are in. Okay, now there are helicopters, and the problem is kind of surpassed, but relatively, because you can't shift all the artillery like that, and some artillery pieces cannot definitely be brought through choppers. So there are so many problems posed by the physical nature of places that are always very important. And just think, in fact, what it meant even to, you know, there were many options. Theoretically, Charles VIII could have even embarked at a point. Unfortunately for him, he didn't, because I think he would have been choked down. But I mean, there were various passages, and the Chisa Pass was just one of the options. So just even think, strategically speaking, to choose, okay, let's pass there instead of another place, and all the complications that there were evidently already known before. So, however, this adds up a little bit to what we were discussing into the other videos about late medieval or early modern artillery. Here, I think with the wars of Italy, we are canonically already into the modern age. But this is a problem, naturally, that, you know, of periodization that doesn't make sense. It was an extremely slow process and very gradual, and it took centuries before certain problems could be fully, you know, solved, and this went along. This is mostly what I would like to leave you with, because not of strictly technological problems, but that were a consequence more than else, but of other developments, chiefly the development of the modern state that could afford to have centralized armies and arsenals, and also to begin to invest into the research of new technologies and so on. But it was very, very progressive. In many ways, early medieval Europe is very similar to medieval Europe, as a matter of fact. There aren't massive, you know, there's not a massive watershed, independently from what especially modernists usually want to stress. But I think it's much more useful. Naturally, they have their reasons historically, but I think it's much more useful to see the actual, not to put watersheds, because there weren't, to make it very, very simple. So to see how this evolved very, very, very slowly. However, I just stop here for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.